She was promised to a duke from birth, but on their wedding day, he chose her prettier, younger sister. Hello readers, welcome to this channel. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you. As you do so, sit back and relax as we dive into this story. Chapter 1. A Promise Broken. The cathedral bells rang out across London. Their solemn chimes, a cruel reminder of what was about to unfold. Lady Charlotte Everleigh, poised and dignified, stood at the altar of St. George's, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The grand hall, decorated in opulent silks and flowers, shimmered under the flickering candlelight. Her bridal gown of ivory lace, though beautiful, felt more like a shroud than a symbol of joy. At 28, Charlotte had long accepted the life that had been mapped out for her. Arranged marriages were as much a part of her world as the afternoon teas and grand balls. Her father, the Earl of Westfield, had promised her to the Duke of Ravenshire when they were both children. The union had been forged not by love, but by duty and status. Two things that Charlotte had grown to understand better than most. She never expected love to find her in the Duke's arms, nor did he seek it in hers. They were to be companions, nothing more. And so, as she stood at the altar, waiting for the ceremony to begin, Charlotte forced herself to smile. This was her duty. This was what she had been trained for. The Duke was a man of wealth, title, and reputation. Their marriage would restore the Everleigh name to prominence, ensuring that her family could continue to live in the lap of luxury. Love was a luxury that neither of them could afford. The priest began his opening prayer, but Charlotte's mind was far from the sanctity of the occasion. Her thoughts drifted, not toward the Duke, but to her younger sister, Amelia, who stood near the front of the pews. At 20, Amelia was everything Charlotte was not. Beautiful, vivacious, and the picture of youth, Amelia had never known the cold, calculated world Charlotte inhabited. She was, in many ways, the exact opposite of her elder sister. Charlotte glanced over at Amelia, whose wide, innocent eyes were fixed on her. Amelia looked radiant in her lavender gown, her dark hair styled in soft curls that framed her face like a portrait. There was no mistaking the fact that Amelia was the kind of woman who drew men's gazes wherever she went. Charlotte, on the other hand, had always been the steady, reliable one. It was her strength that had kept their family afloat when her mother had passed, and it was her sense of duty that had led her to accept her fate. But today, standing next to Amelia, she felt a pang of envy. Amelia was so full of life. She was everything Charlotte had once dreamed, of being free to love and live, without the weight of duty pressing down on her. Charlotte had never had that luxury. The Duke of Ravenshire, Cameron Darnley, stood at the altar now, tall and composed, his dark eyes set on her with a cool, indifferent gaze. She could feel the absence of warmth between them, the emptiness that had always been there. Yet, this was what was expected of them both, nothing more than two people fulfilling their roles. The ceremony continued, the words floating in and out of Charlotte's mind, but she barely heard them. She had already given herself to this life, already surrendered to the inevitability of it all. Her gaze drifted once again to Amelia, who was watching her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. And then the unexpected happened. As the priest asked, "Do you, Cameron Darnley, Duke of Ravenshire, take this woman, Lady Charlotte Everleigh, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Charlotte's heart skipped a beat, waiting for the expected, familiar words. But they never came. The Duke took a deep breath, his expression stiff as stone, before he turned his gaze from Charlotte to Amelia, who stood in the crowd, frozen. His voice, steady but with an unmistakable edge, broke the silence. "I must apologize, Lady Charlotte," he began, his words cutting through the air like a dagger, "but I cannot marry you." The words hung in the air, a sharp, bitter truth that reverberated through Charlotte's body. For a moment, she thought she might collapse right there, in front of the crowd, in front of the priest, in front of her family. But Charlotte's voice caught in her throat. She was not prepared for this. Not now, not here. "Please, let me explain," the Duke continued, his voice softer now, but still tinged with an emotion Charlotte could not place. "I made a vow when I was young to honour this agreement, but I can no longer honour it in good faith." He looked down at his feet, gathering his thoughts. "My heart lies elsewhere, with someone who has become far more than just a promise." Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest. Amelia. And then, as if the words were not enough, the Duke's gaze shifted again, locking onto her sister standing in the crowd. "Amelia, I love you," he said, his voice ringing out across the hushed room. Charlotte's blood turned to ice as she followed his gaze. Amelia was standing there, stunned, her mouth slightly agape. The world seemed to slow as Amelia's eyes met Charlotte's, filled with confusion and shock. The whispers began, low murmurs of disbelief, a gasp from one of the guests. Charlotte's chest constricted with the sudden, overwhelming weight of betrayal. Amelia, who had never asked for this, who had never sought the Duke's attention, now found herself thrust into the centre of a scandal she could not control. Her face flushed a deep shade of red, her eyes darting between Charlotte and the Duke. She looked like a child caught in a game far too big for her. "Amelia, will you marry me?" The Duke's voice was clear now, unwavering. Charlotte's vision blurred as she tried to steady herself, but the world seemed to spin. Amelia? Her younger sister, the girl who had always been her shadow, her closest friend, now the woman who would take the place Charlotte had prepared for herself since she was a child. Amelia's hands trembled at her sides as the room waited. Charlotte watched her sister, seeing the conflict in her eyes, the overwhelming emotions that threatened to swallow her whole. And then, in the midst of all the chaos, Amelia nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hushed gasp of the crowd. Charlotte's heart shattered in a way that words could not describe. She was drowning in a sea of shock and heartbreak, the weight of the broken promise pressing down on her chest. As Amelia walked forward, her eyes avoiding Charlotte's gaze, Charlotte could not move. The room seemed to close in around her, the ornate walls mocking her as the ceremony that should have marked the beginning of her life, instead turned into the funeral of her dreams. The Duke of Ravenshire had chosen her younger sister over her. His love had never been hers, not really. Charlotte felt a deep, consuming ache as she stood there, trapped in the wreckage of her own life. The promise was broken. The future she had so carefully crafted for herself had been ripped away in an instant. And Amelia, the girl who had always been everything Charlotte was not, now stood in her place. The world was changing around her, and Charlotte had no idea who she was in it anymore. Chapter 2. The Sisters' Struggle. The sound of the carriage wheels was the only thing that broke the heavy silence, as Charlotte Everleigh sat with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, staring blankly at the road ahead. The evergreens lining the long, winding drive to the family estate blurred in the distance, but she didn't care. It was as though the world had dimmed around her, leaving only the cold emptiness of her heart. The grand ceremony, the shocking declaration, the scandalous betrayal, it was all still fresh in her mind, replaying in cruel flashes. The Duke of Ravenshire's words had burned into her chest, and the image of Amelia standing by his side had seared itself into her soul. She could still hear the whispers, the shocked gasps, the muffled conversations that had followed her out of that church. The world had witnessed her downfall, and it seemed there was no escaping the weight of it. Charlotte had been prepared for disappointment, perhaps. She had never been under any illusion that her marriage to the Duke would be one of passion or deep affection. She had resigned herself to the reality of duty. But this was different. This was a cruelty she had not expected. She had been promised to the Duke since childhood, a promise her father had made for the sake of security and family legacy. She had played her part, never once questioning the path laid before her. But now, as she sat alone in the carriage, Charlotte wondered if it had all been for nothing. The estate finally loomed before her, its imposing stone walls mirroring the fortress of isolation Charlotte had built around herself. She had not even the strength to step down from the carriage. The idea of returning to a house that once felt like home, now a place of mockery and shame, left her feeling hollow inside. She did not even care to greet the staff when she entered. She barely acknowledged the sympathetic glances of the servants who'd once served her with such warmth. It was too much, too painful. She retreated to her private rooms, where the curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the light of day. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. Her eyes were red from crying, her face pale, streaked with the remnants of emotion she didn't know how to contain. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Charlotte couldn't help but feel one thing, above all else: betrayal. She had always known that her life was not her own. Her marriage to the Duke was a contract, nothing more, and she had accepted that. What hurt most wasn't the loss of her marriage. It was the realization that she had never really mattered in the Duke's life at all. His affections, so easily swayed by the allure of youth and beauty, had never been hers to claim. But it wasn't just the Duke who had betrayed her. It was Amelia, her sister, the girl who had always looked up to her, always followed in her footsteps, now standing at the centre of the scandal. Amelia had never asked for this. She had never sought the Duke's attention. Yet there she was, swept up in the whirlwind of his desire, leaving Charlotte behind like an old promise no one cared to fulfill. The thought gnawed at Charlotte Amelia's innocence, had somehow robbed her of everything she thought she had a right to. Was she so invisible? Was she so easily forgotten? Her stomach twisted as she thought of Amelia, who had taken the Duke's hand without question, without hesitation. Amelia had always been the pretty one, the carefree one. Charlotte had always been the steady, reliable sister, the one who protected, who guarded, who played the part. But now, Amelia was the one who had captured the Duke's heart, the one who would be the Duchess, while Charlotte was left with nothing but the remnants of a life she never chose. Amelia, for her part, was struggling in her own way. The first few days after the wedding disaster were a blur of congratulations, well wishes, and a barrage of people telling her how lucky she was. Everyone spoke to her as though she had won some prize. How did it feel, they asked, to be the Duke's beloved? Amelia smiled through it all, but inside she was numb. She had never asked for this. The Duke's sudden affection felt like an overwhelming responsibility, a duty she hadn't bargained for. She had admired him from a distance. Yes, he was the Duke, after all, an important and powerful figure in society. But love? True love? That had never entered her mind. Amelia had never thought of herself as someone who could fulfill such a heavy role. The idea of marrying him, the man her sister had been promised to, left her feeling guilty and uncertain. She had tried to talk to Charlotte, but her sister had shut her out. How could she blame her? Amelia could see the anger in Charlotte's eyes whenever she looked at her. She had never wanted to be the one who caused Charlotte's pain. But now, the distance between them seemed unbridgeable. Amelia couldn't help but feel the weight of what she had done, torn between her growing sense of obligation to her family and the painful truth that her love for the Duke wasn't real. Amelia found herself spending long hours in the gardens, walking through the tangled maze of roses, lost in thought. She had always found comfort in nature, but now even the beauty of the blooms felt hollow. How could she live with herself, knowing the damage she had caused? How could she look Charlotte in the eye again? The guilt clawed at her. Charlotte had never been able to love the Duke, but she had made peace with her role in the marriage. Amelia, on the other hand, had no such peace. She didn't love the Duke, but she had accepted his proposal out of a sense of duty to her family. She knew what it meant to them, to her mother, to her father, and to the legacy of the Everleigh name. But at what cost? Could she truly go through with this, knowing how it had torn her sister apart? A week passed before Charlotte saw the Duke again. It was late in the evening when he arrived at the Everleigh estate, his manner still as formal as it had been at the wedding. He had come, not to apologize, but to explain. "I never meant to hurt you, Charlotte," the Duke said quietly, standing at the door of her sitting room, his tall figure blocking the light from the hall. "You must understand, I was drawn to Amelia. She is everything I thought I needed." The words struck Charlotte like a blow. Everything I thought I needed. Her breath caught in her throat as she faced him, the man who had once been her promised husband. "And I wasn't?" she asked, her voice colder than she intended. The Duke shifted uncomfortably. "No," he admitted, his eyes downcast. "You were duty. Amelia is different. She brings something out in me that you never could." He paused, his gaze rising to meet hers. "It's not about you, Charlotte. It's about what I need, what I've always needed." Charlotte's heart ached. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to make him understand the depth of her pain. But she was too tired, too broken. She had given him everything, her heart, her duty, her future, and in the end, it had never been enough. "I see," she whispered, her voice small, crushed by the weight of his words. She could feel the walls she had so carefully built around her heart begin to crumble, piece by painful piece. The Duke stepped closer, his voice softer now. "I never wanted to hurt you, Charlotte, but I'm afraid I'm already in too deep with Amelia. I cannot change it. I wish I could." Charlotte's chest tightened. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't even guilty. She swallowed hard. "You've made your choice, and I've made mine," she said, turning her back to him. "I think it's time for you to leave." For a long moment there was silence. Then, with a final, resigned sigh, the Duke left, the door closing softly behind him. Charlotte didn't know how to feel anymore. Everything she had once known about love, about duty, about family, was slipping through her fingers like sand. But one thing was certain. She could never go back, and neither could Amelia. Chapter 3. A Choice of the Heart. The days bled into each other, each one a blur of quiet anguish and strained silence. The early spring sunshine filtered weakly through the curtains of Charlotte's room, casting long shadows on the walls. The air felt heavy with unspoken words, the atmosphere thick with the remnants of that dreadful day. Charlotte had not cried since the night of the wedding, not because the tears had run dry, but because something inside her had frozen. For weeks, she had buried herself in the responsibilities of the estate. She made sure the servants were well attended, ensured the family finances were in order, and even began overseeing the preparations for the upcoming ball, something she knew would be expected of her, but a task that, for the first time, felt entirely hollow. She played the role of the dutiful daughter, the one who put her family's needs before her own, as always. But deep down, the bitterness and sorrow that had once consumed her were slowly morphing into something else, a quiet, simmering resolve. She could not go on like this. She could not continue to live in the shadow of a marriage that had never been hers to claim. The Duke had chosen her sister, Amelia, and with that choice he had irrevocably destroyed the fragile dream Charlotte had clung to for so long. But it was not just the Duke's betrayal that weighed heavily on Charlotte's heart. It was the realization that she had spent her life giving up pieces of herself for others, the promises she made to her family, the duty she had taken on as the eldest daughter, the role she had played in society as a woman of substance. None of it had ever been for her. And now she was at a crossroads. She could continue to serve others, burying herself in duties that felt more like chains than responsibilities. Or she could do the unthinkable, carve a new path for herself. One afternoon, as she sat in the drawing room, absent-mindedly running her fingers over the pages of a book she hadn't read, she was interrupted by the soft knock on the door. A voice, familiar and comforting, called through the wood. "Charlotte, may I come in?" It was Lord Theodore Blackwood, her childhood friend, who had been a steady presence in her life since they were both children. Theodore was a man of few words but deep understanding. His affection for her had always been quiet, unobtrusive. He had never asked for more than her friendship, but she had always known it was there. She had often wondered, in the quiet of her own heart, whether there might have been a time when things could have been different between them. But such thoughts had always seemed irrelevant, buried under the weight of her family's expectations and her own sense of duty. When she opened the door, Theodore stood before her, his dark hair slightly dishevelled and his hands clasped nervously behind his back. His eyes, usually warm and kind, were filled with something more an earnestness that made Charlotte's breath catch in her chest. "Charlotte," he began, his voice soft but firm, "I cannot stand by any longer and watch you suffer in silence. I know you have chosen to carry this burden alone, but it need not be so." Charlotte bit her lip, resisting the urge to turn away. Theodore had always been a friend, but in this moment he was more than that. He was an ally, someone who could offer her a way out of the life she had known. His words stirred something deep within her, a yearning she had kept buried for far too long, but she hesitated. She didn't know what it meant to choose herself. She didn't know if she even had the right. "Theodore, you know why I must stay here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My family, they need me. Amelia needs me." The words were hollow, but they were the truth she had always lived by. She had always put the needs of others before her own. Theodore stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You are not a commodity, Charlotte," he said softly. "You are a woman with dreams, with desires, with a heart that deserves to be loved and cherished. You have spent your life living for others. It's time to live for yourself." Her chest tightened at his words. His sincerity was so raw, so real. But how could she? How could she leave everything she had ever known? The expectations of society, the love of her family, the duty that had shaped every moment of her life, they all seemed too powerful, too binding for her to just walk away from. "I don't know how," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to choose love when all I've known is duty. How do I even know what love is, Theodore? The Duke didn't love me. He never did. How can I trust that love is real when it's been nothing but an illusion for so long?" Theodore's expression softened, and he gently cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Love is not a fairy tale, Charlotte. It's not about being swept off your feet or having everything fit into a neat little box. It's about choosing someone, choosing yourself, and being brave enough to face the unknown. I have always loved you, and I know that I always will, but this is not about me. It's about you, Charlotte. What do you want? His words landed like a weight on her heart. What did she want? She had never asked herself that question. Her life had always been about fulfilling the needs of others, her family, society, the expectations placed upon her. But now, in this moment, the possibility of something else hung in the air. Charlotte felt something shift inside her, a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel what she had buried for so long. A longing for freedom, for a life not dictated by duty, for the chance to finally choose herself. But even as this realization washed over her, the weight of responsibility still held her captive. She thought of Amelia, the sister who had unknowingly taken the Duke's hand in her place. Amelia, who had her own struggles, her own fears, and her own questions. How could Charlotte leave now, knowing the turmoil it would cause her sister? How could she walk away from the family that needed her? As if reading her thoughts, Theodore spoke again. I understand the burden you feel, Charlotte, but you must understand this. Your happiness matters. You matter. A surge of emotion welled up inside her. She had never felt so torn, but the seed had been planted. Theodore had given her the courage to finally ask herself what she wanted. For too long, she had lived in the shadow of others' expectations, never daring to dream for herself. But now, the possibility of something more was within reach. Amelia, meanwhile, was coming to terms with her own heartache. She was struggling with her feelings for someone else, someone she could not claim, and the growing realization that her place by the Duke's side might not be the life she wanted after all. The pressure of her sister's pain weighed heavily on her, and as much as she tried to convince herself that she was doing the right thing, a part of her wondered if she could ever truly love someone out of duty. As the days passed, Charlotte's resolve grew stronger. The decision was clear now. She would leave. She would leave the estate, the title, the expectations, and she would find out who she truly was, free from the chains that had bound her for so long. And so, with a heart still heavy, but filled with the first glimmers of hope, Charlotte made her decision. She would no longer be a pawn in a game she never chose. She would carve out a life for herself, and maybe, just maybe, she would learn what it meant to love, not out of obligation, but out of choice. With one last look at the estate that had been her prison, Charlotte packed her bags and prepared to step into the unknown, leaving behind the life she had known for one that was all her own. Chapter 4. Unlikely Lovers. Charlotte's departure sent ripples through the carefully manicured fabric of society. It was almost as if she had fallen off the edge of the earth. One moment she was the dutiful daughter, the reliable presence in the Everleigh household, and the next she was gone. No longer bound by the expectations of her family, Charlotte retreated to the countryside, to the estate of her distant relative, Lady Olivia Pembroke, whose quiet manor sat nestled among the rolling hills and thick woods. Charlotte had never known Lady Pembroke well. She was an eccentric widow, with a sharp wit and an even sharper tongue. But Lady Olivia had welcomed Charlotte with open arms, offering her sanctuary in the solitude of the countryside, away from the prying eyes of London. It was here that Charlotte began to rediscover herself, not the woman bound by duty, but the woman who could choose. It was here, too, that she began to understand the painful complexities of love, of choosing love, of learning to trust it again. The days were slower here, but they gave Charlotte the space she had longed for. There was something serene about the countryside, the soft murmuring of the brook that ran through Lady Pembroke's gardens, the rustling of the leaves in the trees, the distant call of birds. It was peaceful in a way that soothed the jagged edges of her soul, but it was also a place where her thoughts could not escape her. The pain of the betrayal, the Duke's decision to choose Amelia over her, still lingered, like a wound that refused to heal. Yet, as time passed, she began to realize something she hadn't been able to admit in the wake of the disaster. She was no longer defined by the Duke's rejection. In her quiet room at Lady Pembroke's manor, Charlotte took up painting, a hobby she had abandoned years ago in favour of family obligations. She had always enjoyed it, but her life had never allowed her to indulge in the freedom of creativity. Now, her days were filled with the hum of the brush against canvas, the mixing of colours, the quiet moments of introspection as she lost herself in her work. She painted landscapes, at first fields of golden wheat, skies at dusk, the rolling hills that stretched beyond the estate. But slowly her work began to shift. Her brushstrokes grew bolder, her subjects more personal. She painted not just nature, but the very emotions she had kept hidden for so long, the heartbreak, the fear, the yearning for something more. But it wasn't just painting that gave her solace. It was Lord Theodore Blackwood. Theodore had always been a part of Charlotte's life, though only in the background. He was the childhood friend, the quiet figure who had never made his feelings for her known, never demanded anything from her. He had always been there, an ever-present shadow, a steady hand when she needed someone to lean on. His affection for her had never been a grand gesture. It had always been simple, honest, and true. But since Charlotte's departure from London, Theodore had become something more. He had become her confidant, her friend, her pillar of support in a world that had been upended. Theodore too had always believed in duty, but as he spent more time with Charlotte, he began to see the flaws in his own thinking. His feelings for her had always been buried deep, but now, in the quiet of the countryside, with Charlotte finally free to be herself, Theodore saw the woman who had always been beneath the surface strong, capable, and, most of all, kind. She had a heart that had been broken, yes, but it was not shattered. There was still hope in her, still the possibility of something more. It wasn't long before Theodore began to reveal more of himself to her too. His gentle nature, which had always been there, now showed a more vulnerable side. He confessed his own doubts, his own struggles with what society expected of him, and his fear of never being able to break free of those expectations. He had always been the dutiful son, the honourable man, the one who never questioned the roles he was given. But in Charlotte's presence, he began to understand the value of breaking free from those constraints of choosing love, of choosing what was real over what was expected. Charlotte, for the first time in her life, began to see the possibility of a love that was not defined by duty or obligation. She had always been so focused on fulfilling her responsibilities that she never truly allowed herself to question what she wanted, what she needed. But Theodore showed her that love didn't have to be perfect. It didn't have to be grand or dramatic. It could be slow, steady, and, most importantly, it could be real. The more time they spent together, the more Charlotte realized how deeply she had come to care for him. It wasn't the kind of love she had once imagined, fated and passionate, but something quieter, more genuine. Their conversations were easy, their silences comfortable, and the way he looked at her made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. One evening, as they walked through the garden, the setting sun casting long shadows on the ground, Charlotte felt a shift in the air between them. The world seemed to still as Theodore stopped in his tracks, turning to face her. There was a warmth in his gaze, a tenderness she had not noticed before. "Charlotte," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've loved you for so long, in ways I never had the courage to say." But I can't keep pretending that my feelings for you are just a quiet affection. You mean more to me than I can express." Charlotte's heart raced, but she didn't turn away. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something without fear of what it meant. She had spent so long living in the shadow of others' expectations, but here, in this moment, with Theodore, she felt the weight of those years lift. "I've never known a love like this," Charlotte whispered, her voice trembling. "I've spent my life trying to please everyone else. I don't know what it feels like to choose something for myself." Theodore smiled, his hand gently brushing her cheek. "Then choose me, Charlotte. Choose this. Choose us. I promise you, this love will be real. It won't be perfect, but it will be ours." Charlotte took a deep breath, the weight of her past still lingering, but no longer defining her. She had lived for duty, for society, for everyone else, but now, for the first time, she could live for herself. "I choose you," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I choose us." And with those words, Theodore pulled her into a tender embrace. There, in the quiet of the garden, surrounded by the warmth of the fading sun, Charlotte finally allowed herself to feel what it was like to be loved, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Meanwhile, back at the Everleigh estate, Amelia was beginning to realize the cracks in her own facade. She had married the Duke not for love, but for duty, just as Charlotte had feared. She had tried to make the best of it, but something inside her had broken. The Duke, though attentive, was still distant, still wrapped in the cold shell he had built over the years. And as Amelia's feelings for someone else began to grow, she found herself questioning everything she had once believed in. The Duke had chosen her, yes, but it was Charlotte he had truly understood. Amelia now faced the painful truth that their marriage was nothing but a shadow of what true love could be. As Theodore and Charlotte began their new life together, a quiet understanding settled in Amelia's heart. She had a choice to make too, to live for duty or to live for herself. And for the first time, she didn't know what her heart would choose. Chapter 5. Revelations and Redemption. The grand ballroom of Lord and Lady Pembroke's estate shimmered with opulence, the flickering candles casting a soft golden glow across the sea of glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos. The sound of music swirled through the air, elegant waltzes and light-hearted minuets, while the laughter and chatter of society's finest echoed in the background. It was the sort of event where people came to be seen, to reaffirm their status, to bask in the pleasure of knowing their names would be spoken about long after the night ended. But for Charlotte Everleigh, tonight felt like a new beginning. The years of duty, of sorrow, of self-sacrifice, those had all brought her here to this moment where she could finally claim her own story, no longer bound by the expectations of her family or the weight of a promise she never made. Theodore Blackwood stood beside her, his arm securely around her waist, his presence a quiet anchor in a sea of unfamiliar faces. She had never thought of herself as someone who could be loved so freely, so completely, yet with Theodore it had become a reality. He had given her more than just the comfort of friendship. He had given her the courage to live her truth, to choose for herself, and, most importantly, to believe in love again. Her sister Amelia stood at the other end of the room, her figure striking in a gown of deep sapphire, a stark contrast to Charlotte's emerald green. Amelia had come into her own. In the time since Charlotte's departure, she was no longer the innocent, unsure girl who had once stood beside the Duke, unaware of the weight of her own decisions. Charlotte's gaze met Amelia's, and the distance between them felt like both an ocean and a mere step. The past had shaped them both, but it was time to let go of the old narrative that had tied them together: competition, rivalry, and betrayal. Now, both women stood on the threshold of new beginnings, different, but perhaps more whole than they had been before. Amelia's eyes softened when she caught Charlotte's gaze. She had changed too, no longer the bright-eyed girl who had once been swept into the Duke's world. In the months since Charlotte had left, Amelia had come to realize the depth of her own heart, the feelings that had been clouded by duty and expectation. She was no longer the woman who had acted out of obligation. Her heart had finally led her to a place where she could choose a love that was real, not one based on titles or family traditions. Charlotte moved toward her, the crowd parting around them as the two sisters slowly, almost hesitantly, made their way toward one another. There were no words at first, only the heavy, emotional silence of two women who had endured their own battles, who had been forced to face the same devastating reality, but had taken very different paths. The tension in the air was palpable, as if society itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment of reconciliation or confrontation. "Charlotte," Amelia finally whispered, her voice catching with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Charlotte looked at her sister, the words coming out more naturally than she had expected. "You don't need to apologize, Amelia. I understand now. I did not know what I wanted either. I lived my life in a cage of my own making, and you—" Charlotte paused, her heart still heavy, but lighter than it had ever been before. "You were just doing what was expected of you, too." Amelia nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I never wanted to hurt you, Charlotte. I couldn't see it at the time, but I was trying to make a life for myself in a way that made no sense." She glanced around the room, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could love him, but I couldn't. Not really." Charlotte's heart ached for her sister. The Duke had never been the man he portrayed himself to be, and Amelia had been a casualty of his own selfishness, just as Charlotte had been. "You deserve more than duty, Amelia," Charlotte said, her voice firm. "We both do. We always have." For the first time in years, they embraced no longer the rivals they once were, but two women who had both struggled and suffered, each finding the strength to move forward. They stood there for a long moment, in the warmth of the ballroom, but in their own private world of healing and forgiveness. And then the Duke appeared. His tall frame cut through the crowd with an air of authority that he had never quite shed, but there was something different about him tonight. His expression was one of resignation, of regret. Perhaps, finally, he had come to terms with his own decisions, with the selfishness that had driven him to tear apart the lives of two sisters. He approached Charlotte first, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to find the pieces of their past that could still be salvaged. "Charlotte," he began, his voice low, "I've come to realize that I never truly knew what love was. I chose the easy path, the one that looked right on paper. But I was wrong. I never wanted to hurt you. No," Charlotte interrupted, her voice steady. "You wanted what you wanted, and you took it without considering anyone else. I'm not angry with you, but I am no longer a part of your life. I've chosen my own path now, and it's not one that includes you." The Duke's face fell, the weight of her words crashing down on him. For a moment, he seemed like the man who had first asked for her hand, uncertain, regretful, and now completely aware of the consequences of his actions. But the truth was, it was too late. Charlotte had found herself, and she had no intention of going back to a life that had never been hers to live. The Duke's gaze shifted to Amelia, who stood beside Charlotte, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and newfound strength. "Amelia," he said, his voice softer now, I have made a terrible mess of things, and I understand if you can't forgive me." Amelia's shoulders straightened, her chin lifting with newfound resolve. "You took my choice away from me, Duke, but that's something I can never forget." She took a breath, her voice firmer now. "I don't hate you, but I don't love you either. Not in the way you thought I did." The Duke looked between the two women, his face contorting with the bitter realization that he had lost everything: his title, his status, and, most painfully, the chance for something real. "Goodbye, Your Grace," Charlotte said, her voice steady. "I hope you find what you're looking for, but I won't be part of your story anymore." With a final glance, the Duke turned and walked away, leaving the two sisters standing together, stronger than before. As the night unfolded, the ball continued in its glimmering splendour, but Charlotte and Amelia no longer felt like mere spectators. They were participants in their own lives now, choosing happiness over obligation, love over fear. Theodore found Charlotte again, her hand slipping into his as they danced together. A slow, simple waltz. There was no need for grand declarations, no need for words. They had both already made their choice. "We've come full circle, haven't we?" Theodore whispered, his gaze soft. Charlotte nodded, her heart full. "Yes, and this time I'm choosing a life I want, not one that's been dictated for me." The night ended not with the usual rumours and gossip that followed the departure of every high society couple, but with a quiet sense of fulfilment. The Duke's attempts at redemption had come too late, but for Charlotte and Amelia there was no need for him any more. Their future was theirs to define. As the ballroom doors closed behind them, Charlotte and Theodore stepped out into the cool night air, side by side, ready to face whatever came next, with love, with courage, and, most importantly, with the freedom to choose. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share. Your support helps us continue creating more stories of love, redemption, and second chances that matter. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our romantic stories. Click and discover more beautiful tales of courage and connection. With all our gratitude. Duke's Story.